History likes to tell us that disaster begins with ambition, with miscalculation, with men making terrible decisions. But sometimes, history breaks for a stranger reason. Sometimes the spark is a wing beat, a drifting swarm, a curious paw, or a creature following nothing more than instinct. Across skies, cities, railways, farms, and power grids, animals have collided with human systems in ways no one could have predicted. No malice, no master plan, just nature moving through our world and accidentally changing it forever. Tonight, we're counting down 10 times animals triggered major human disasters. On a cold afternoon in 1962, United Airlines Flight 297 looked like the definition of routine. Calm skies, a steady route from Newark toward Washington. Nothing unusual in the cabin, nothing alarming in the cockpit, nothing to suggest the flight would become a tragedy. Then, high above the ground, a single swan crossed paths with a machine built to conquer the sky. It was a whistling swan, large enough to turn a bird's strike into something far more serious. The impact damaged the aircraft's horizontal stabilizer, a critical surface for keeping the plane stable in flight. Within moments, control was gone. The aircraft broke apart in midair, and all 17 people on board were killed. It sounds impossible, almost absurd, until you remember one brutal truth. Even the most advanced machine can fail when nature touches the wrong place at the wrong speed. Pilots are trained to doubt many things, but one number they depend on completely is airspeed. If that number lies, every decision that follows begins to unravel. That is what happened in 1996 on Virgin Air Flight 301. The Boeing 757 had been sitting idle on the ground in the Dominican Republic for days. During that quiet stretch, investigators believe a mud dauber wasp likely built a nest inside one of the plane's pitot tubes, the narrow sensor used to measure airspeed. When the jet finally took off, that tiny obstruction started feeding false data to the cockpit. Warnings sounded. Readings conflicted. Confusion spread faster than the crew could solve it. In only a few minutes, the aircraft entered a fatal descent and crashed into the Atlantic, killing all 189 people on board. No bomb, no dramatic structural explosion, just one insect choosing the worst possible place in the world to build a home. Some disasters are terrifying because we know exactly how they started. This one is haunting because we may never know for sure. For more than a century, the Great Chicago Fire has been tied to one unforgettable image. Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern in a small barn on the night of October 8, 1871. It is the kind of story people love because it turns chaos into something simple, visual, and easy to blame. The fire spread with astonishing force, destroying more than 17,000 buildings and leaving roughly 100,000 people homeless. Yet the famous cow almost certainly never did it. Historians now believe the story was likely exaggerated or possibly invented by a journalist who gave a citywide catastrophe a neat and unforgettable villain. And maybe that is why the myth survived. Because sometimes a disaster feels so large, so random, and so merciless that people reach for one innocent creature just to make the story feel understandable.
Another Ripper exclusive for the Chronicle.
Not every catastrophe arrives in flames. Some arrive quietly, hidden in shadows, carried in fur, and spread along the same routes that once built the world. For centuries, black rats moved with human trade, slipping through ship holds, warehouses, alleys, and crowded cities. Wherever the rats went, fleas followed. And where those fleas traveled, so did the bacterium linked to bubonic plague. By the middle of the 14th century, the Black Death had torn across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people. Entire communities disappeared. Economies bent under the strain. Social order cracked under the weight of sudden, unimaginable loss. Historians still debate the exact balance of transmission between rats, fleas, human parasites, and possibly airborne spread. But the rats remain part of the story because they moved through the machinery of trade without knowing they were helping carry one of the deadliest disasters in human history. Sometimes disaster does not explode into view. Sometimes it darkens the horizon first. In 2020, enormous swarms of desert locusts descended across East Africa and parts of the Middle East, creating one of the most severe agricultural emergencies in decades. From a distance, a swarm can look almost unreal, like dust or weather. Up close, it becomes something far more frightening, a living storm made of hunger. A single swarm can spread across hundreds of square miles and contain billions of insects. In one day, that mass can consume as much food as tens of millions of people. Fields that had taken months to cultivate were stripped down in hours. Crops vanished. For families already living near the edge of food insecurity, the timing was devastating. Combined with climate stress and economic strain, the outbreak pushed entire regions toward famine conditions and forced emergency responses on a massive scale. No cruelty, no strategy, just wind, breeding conditions, and a species doing exactly what it evolved to do.
Initiating stabilization sequence.
A nuclear power station is built around precision. Every pipe, every filter, every backup system exists to keep control absolute. And yet in 2011, off the coast of Scotland, Torness Nuclear Power Station was interrupted by one of the softest creatures in the sea. Plant operators noticed the cooling system intake filters were clogging far faster than normal. The cause was not sabotage, not software failure, not human error. It was a bloom of jellyfish drifting into the intake area in overwhelming numbers. Their bodies began to block the filtration system that protected the cooling process, forcing operators to shut down one reactor as a precaution against overheating. There was no explosion, no cinematic collapse, no traditional destruction. The systems worked, and the shutdown was controlled. But that was the lesson. Even critical infrastructure designed for constant operation can be slowed or stopped by marine life moving in vast numbers through the wrong channel at the wrong moment. And Torness was not even unique. Similar problems have struck power facilities in other countries as well. Australia's rabbit disaster did not begin with panic. It began with confidence. In 1859, rabbits were introduced for sport hunting, a small and casual decision that would grow into one of the most notorious ecological disasters in modern history. Freed into an environment where they multiplied rapidly, rabbit populations exploded into the hundreds of millions. They devoured vegetation faster than it could recover. Farmland weakened. Soil erosion intensified. Native species were pushed aside as entire ecological balances shifted. And because this collapse moved slowly, it was easy to underestimate in the beginning. But by the early 20th century, the damage had become impossible to ignore. Large areas were suffering agricultural failure, livestock production was affected, and governments were forced into enormous intervention efforts, including fencing projects that stretched across astonishing distances. This was no single dramatic moment. It was worse than that. It was a slow-moving disaster, born from a small human choice and carried forward by animals doing exactly what nature designed them to do: survive, breed, and spread. A train moving through forest expects fallen branches, weather, perhaps even mechanical trouble. What it does not expect is a wall of life too large to stop for. On a railway line in eastern India, a routine passenger train entered a stretch of dense forest where wildlife corridors crossed active tracks. There, a herd of wild elephants had wandered onto the rails. The crew applied emergency braking, but momentum won. The impact was severe enough to derail multiple carriages, injure passengers, and turn a normal journey into a scene of twisted metal and emergency response. The elephants paid the highest price, with several killed in the collision. And as shocking as the event was, it was not isolated. India has seen repeated train-elephant collisions, especially in regions such as Assam and West Bengal, where migration routes intersect rail infrastructure. That is the cruel geometry of expansion. Rails cut across paths that existed long before the trains did, and sometimes the cost of that intersection arrives in a single violent second. Modern power grids are built with layers of protection. They are meant to withstand storms, overloads, and technical faults. But in 2016, Kenya learned that resilience does not always account for curiosity with fur and fingers. At a hydroelectric facility operated by Kengen, a monkey entered the station and came into contact with critical equipment. That single intrusion triggered a cascade failure that cut power generation and led to a nationwide blackout affecting large parts of the country. Businesses were disrupted. Communications were interrupted. Essential services were shaken. Engineers moved quickly to restore power, but the symbolism of the event lingered long after the lights came back on. A national system, enormous and carefully engineered, had been thrown into darkness by one animal moving through a place it was never meant to reach. No hostile act, no cyber attack, no deliberate sabotage, just a moment of contact between wildlife and infrastructure, and a reminder that complexity often hides surprising points of weakness. And at number 1, the most famous bird strike in modern aviation. On January 15, 2009, U.S. Airways Flight 1549 departed New York's LaGuardia Airport on what should have been an ordinary flight to Charlotte. Minutes later, the Airbus A320 flew directly into a flock of Canada geese at low altitude. Multiple birds were ingested by both engines, causing a near-total loss of thrust. In seconds, a passenger jet above one of the most densely populated urban regions in America became a glider with no working engines. Captain Chesley Sullenberger and First Officer Jeffrey Skiles had almost no time to think. No runway was realistically within reach, so they chose the Hudson River. The aircraft hit the water, remained intact, and all 155 people on board survived. The world remembers it as the miracle on the Hudson, and rightly so. But behind the miracle was a brutal truth. The event began with an accidental collision between wildlife and modern aviation, one that could just as easily have ended as one of New York's worst air disasters. So what do all these stories have in common? A swan, a wasp, a cow that may never have done it, rats on trade routes, locusts in the sky, jellyfish in seawater, rabbits in open land, elephants on the rails, a monkey in a power station, and geese over New York. None of them meant to reshape history. None of them understood the systems they touched. But that is exactly the point. Human civilization is powerful, brilliant, and vast, yet it is still vulnerable to the quiet force of the natural world. And if you enjoy stories like this, here's the move. Subscribe now before you forget. Hit like if this one surprised you, and share it with one friend who loves unbelievable true history. That little action helps this channel far more than most people realize. And if you want more cinematic stories where one small moment changes everything, stay with us. The next one is never as far away as it seems.